All right. Happy Monday, everybody. It's February 6th, 2017, and this is Kubernetes SIG service catalog. So we got a few things on the agenda today. The first is just an overall checkpoint of kind of where we're at. We've now hit all of the things that are in the Legos 1 milestone, which is great, and I thank all of you that have been contributing to this effort for your help achieving that. That is really big. So we have an API server that works in connection with etcd. You can use kubectl to persist resources, broker service class instance and binding, and read them back out. We discovered a bug actually with the help of Juan Vallejo, who works on the OpenShift user experience team, and Phil Whitrock. We figured out that kubectl needs to use a different API client than it was. That will help us work around or solve this issue that if you played with the API server, you'll see that you sometimes will get an error that says failed to negotiate API version for blah, 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 blah. So that puts us in a really good spot. We also have a generated Golang client now, and we're at a point where we can begin developing a controller that uses the shared informer architecture that I spoke about on the last call. So I actually have a work in progress pull request where I'm kind of putting together a controller skeleton. That my intent is to just put the skeleton together, and then we can port over the business logic from the existing controller. Our next milestone that we're heading towards is at the end of February, beginning of March, something that is in kind of an MVP state. For those of you that haven't been, attending all the meetings, the idea was that that goal we felt was a little aggressive in order to give us time to have some slip in the event that, we encounter some unexpected technical hurdles or, just that things, and I know this sounds crazy, but they sometimes take longer than you think they will. So we tried to just be conservative with our planning for that purpose, and I personally feel like pretty good about our ability to hit that date. So everybody give yourselves a pat on the back, and thanks again for all the hard work that's gone into this so far. I really, I think this group has come quite a long way. Since when we started, we had so many different folks with different contexts, and it's not as though we necessarily agree on everything at this moment, but I think that we certainly have developed a group understanding that I think is really valuable, and I'm really, really excited to see these final pieces fall together to get us to something that is MVP 1. So next up on the agenda is Aaron. You have the floor to talk about TPRs.
So I'm in witness protection mode right now.
Right.
I think I just have a shadow of my face.
Aaron's coming to us from an undisclosed location.
Yeah, backlit. So I wanted to mention, kind of in line with Paul's implementation status point here, we are hooking up the controller to the API server. And currently, as Paul also mentioned, the API server is backed with etcd as the data store. I'm currently working on an alternative data store, which is using third-party resources as basically a key value store. There is a work in progress pull request, number 338, if you want to see what's going on there. That is not ready for review, so your comments will probably be overwritten and not addressed. But the goal there is to get bindings persisted to TPRs, and then future pull requests will address the other 3 object types. So again, having the new controller that Paul has begun talk to the API server. The API server then can be configured to talk to third-party resources instead of etcd. And in doing so, we, Deis, have wanted a third-party resource-backed solution for a long time. In doing so, with the same controller code base, with no changes, we can simply set a flag on the API server to get it to use third-party resources only and not have to set up an etcd off to the side. So I'll continue to update the group in the Slack channel for what's going on with the third-party resource implementation. And of course, you can follow along with 338 as well. And of course, I will also probably be reaching out to some of you for questions as well. So that is it for me. And I think, Paul, I'll throw it back to you.
Oh, no, dude, your cover's blown.
Oh,
I can see your face.
Oh, crap.
All right. So next on the agenda is, I know there were some questions about pull request number 334 to the incubator repo. That is to add GUID defaults for instance and binding. So we have some time now. We can talk through that and hopefully answer any questions that might be lying in wait. Doug and Morgan, I know you guys both had some questions about this.
Well, it's just when I looked at the title of that PR and even the text of the PR, it basically says we're going to default GUIDs, which is great. But I have no idea what the rest of the fuzzer stuff does. And if all we're doing is setting GUIDs, why we need it.
Okay, so I can answer that question. That's actually an easy one. So here's the story with the fuzzer is that in order to, so let me see, what's the right order to explain this in? So when you round trip an API object, the defaults are applied. And the reason that we had to add the fuzzer is that when you do the round trip test, you have to be able to say, hey, I got the same object back out of this thing. And what will happen if you don't add the fuzzer is you make a new, reflectively create a new API object, and you convert it into the version format from the internal format. In doing this, you apply the defaults, and so the object that you get back when you round trip it back to internal API version, it will not be the exact same object that you put in because it will have had the default applied, and this will break the test. So there is, and we should totally feed this back into the API changes document if it's not already in there. If you have a default for a field, you have to fuzz that field so that the default isn't mutating the object when it gets applied. Does that make sense?
Yeah, conceptually. It just feels like it's a whole lot of code for an if statement, but okay.
Well, okay, so everything that Paul just said about the fuzzers, that is, very specifically so that the tests aren't broken by the default stuff that was added. I think what might be more valuable context to the whole group, including to myself who wrote the PR, would be if Paul could possibly explain why Kubernetes takes this approach of using API machinery to apply defaults instead of doing it someplace else where it could be done more simply and easily, like in the controller, where we actually do have that very same logic today. So we're moving that stuff up into the API machinery, and it might be good for all of us to understand why.
Well, I can take a stab at answering that question now. Here's my stab. All right. So if you were to implement defaults in controllers, you wind up with potential race conditions where multiple controllers that might be acting on an object are applying their own defaults, and they're either racing with one another, persisting them, or you're leaving it also to the controller author to persist them, and the controller author might make a mistake. Secondly, if you apply a default in a controller, you then have to persist it before you really can act on it, because if someone comes along and destroys the controller process and you've taken some action based on a default that you applied that wasn't persisted, you've made the API objects not useful as a source of record. So I would say that that is my TLDR of why we apply defaults in this way. But as with all things Kubernetes, I'm not the inventor of Kubernetes, so I would be happy to see if we can talk to some of the API machinery folks and distill out some of this knowledge and rationale into something that's easy to consume, that doesn't depend on my availability to explain it, or my bandwidth, or my ability to explain it. So this actually dovetails really well into the next thing that I want to talk about. But before we do that, does what I said make sense? And do people agree that this is part of the general class of questions that why does Kubernetes do a certain thing that I think would be really productive to have written down somewhere?
So, Paul, quick question for you. If you have two controllers acting on the same resource, wouldn't the second one fail as put because the version string would be different?
Yeah, but I guess the issue is that I don't understand why there's a need to do it in a controller if you have an avenue to do it as part of the API machinery. It seems sensible to me that just in general, forget about Kubernetes, that defaults should be applied one time before an object is initially persisted.
Yeah, my question actually wasn't about that PR in particular. I just want to make sure I understood the controller logic.
Oh, okay. Yes, you are absolutely correct, Doug. If you and for those that don't immediately know what Doug is talking about, every Kubernetes object has an object version field, and it's incremented every time that object is updated in etcd. So what Doug is referring to is that part of the machinery that is involved at the persistence layer is checking that you are updating an object that from a equal to, or I want to say, I'm not finding the right words, but
it's an optimistic lock.
Yes, correct. Bam. Thank you. Was that Kent?
Yes.
Very good, Kent. So it uses this object version field to implement an optimistic lock. If you give it an update based on an out-of-date version, it's going to kick you out. So yes, you are accurate, Doug.
Okay, so then a quick question about the fuzzer stuff.
Okay.
I think I understood in general what you guys were talking about in terms of you got to do something, because when you put an object and then you get it back out to do your test and make sure it's the same object, things are going to be different because of defaults. So the fuzzer we'll go through and identify the fields that will get defaulted and somehow kind of mask those during the test? Is that a fair way to think of it?
Yeah, so the fuzzer sets fields that would be defaulted so that the defaults don't mutate it.
How is that? How are we then testing to make sure that the default logic does kick in then?
Say that again, Doug?
Well, if the fuzzer is setting default values on the way in, and we're not letting our defaulting logic kick in because otherwise it's random values, when does the defaulter logic actually get kicked in during our tests?
No,
there are separate tests to test the default logic.
Ah, got it. Okay.
So the fuzzers are only incorporated into the serialization tests that do the round trip.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So it sounds like that's put to bed now. Is that accurate, folks?
I would just add, I put a link into the chat, github.com/google/gofuzz, all one word. That's a very useful library to familiarize yourself with. It's very small as well, and it will help greatly in understanding just generically the K8s tests regarding serialization and object storage. So if you haven't, just go give the README a read through. It's pretty short.
Okay, so as I said, this discussion like dovetails really well into the next thing that I have on the agenda. And those of you who have been attending the meetings, which honestly I think is all of you that are in attendance today, but for those of you that are watching on the internet, maybe you haven't attended all the meetings. One thing that has been a challenge and significant expenditure of time in the process of creating this incubator project that we have for Service Catalog has been that the incubation process document is extremely light on details of this kind. As an example, this thing with defaults and so forth, but more generally, matters of process and community norms. So there are two roles that are specified by the incubator or by the incubation process. And one of those is the sponsor, who basically is one of the owners of Kubernetes and is the authority from which the authority that grants us the permission to consider something an incubator project. And then there's the repo champion, who's part of the role. Let me see. I'll read you all the verbiage, and I think you can agree with me. This is extremely general sounding. So, potential champions come from the set of all Kubernetes approvers and reviewers, with the hope that they will be able to teach the incubator project about Kubernetes community norms and processes. The champion is the primary point of contact for the incubator project team and will help guide the team through the process, et cetera, et cetera. So these community norms and practices that are the province of the incubator repo champion to disseminate and teach are really not defined in any way by this document. And as many of you know, like Kubernetes is become popular so rapidly that the demands on the community have really outpaced the resources and time available to distill some of these things. So I've been kind of working on an issue that I'm going to pose to the community repo to define some of these things. And I think there's a number of touch points, like probably there's some degree of adoption of the community norms that we want to have be an exit criteria for exiting incubation. But more more generally, I think that one gap that we've all encountered in our experiences with Kubernetes, myself included, possibly more than some of you might realize, is that these norms and practices are really not documented in a central place. Now, we're making some strides on that, but a lot of the there's an additional layer of knowledge beyond what the facts are, which is the rationale behind the facts, the why. And Kubernetes is already such a large community that I've found that almost nobody knows, one, all of the norms and practices, and then two, almost even fewer people actually know the reasons why. And asking why is a perfectly natural question, or a perfectly natural activity that people do when they're in a situation like you're joining a community that you haven't been part of before. And so I think that one thing I've kind of realized over the last couple weeks is that we hit some of those gaps, and since I know this group is really motivated to make things better for the next people that do this kind of thing, this is something that we should shave off as like an improvement to make to the incubator process, and then to some extent to the community as a whole. So I will post in the SIG channel a link to this issue, and hopefully we can spend some of the energy that we put into negotiating these things for ourselves into finding out and defining what the existing norms and practices might be. Any thoughts about that? Anybody think I'm wrong, or that I'm a bad person for thinking these thoughts?
No, it's exactly what we need. And it harkens back to this constant problem I have where I'm perfectly willing to document and write things down, but I don't know any of the answers, and it's difficult to find them. So
yeah, and even if you have somebody who is not me that understands all the norms and all the reasons why, transmitting this stuff by like oral history is extremely time inefficient. So absent something that already exists, it's our lot to get to be the first people that go through the incubator process, maybe with folks that are like really new to the community, and hit some of these gaps and speed bumps and stuff. Let's see, I had something else to say about this, but it's escaping me at this moment. Any other thoughts about this? Okay, so I want to reorder some of the stuff that's in the agenda document, because I think that the next thing that's in this document is a burn down for how do we get to MVP 1, and I don't think that will fit into half an hour. So that's something that perhaps, like, if we don't get to that, we can break out as a separate meeting later this week. So Morgan, you asked for an explanation of poll 340. Which one is that?
The versioned client set into the correct package. I don't understand what's version client set, unversioned client set. What do we need that this isn't?
Okay, so I will put a link to this in the chat. And Okay. Now, first of all, let me give a shout out to Morgan because he very quickly did what I thought would potentially be like a 1-day thing on, I think it was Friday of last week. So good job with that, Morgan. And the thing that he did,
I got to raise my hand first. The only reason I could do that is because there was documentation on how to do it.
well,
Literally, there was documentation. I read the documentation and I did it, which I think proves the worth of having documentation.
yes, we have
to throw that out. It's Caesar Zhu Xiao. I can't say the name right, but that's wrote the client Go, wrote the documentation for client Chen. Hey, it works.
Well, good job, Caesar, and good job, Kubernetes, for having documentation on this. So let's talk about what this is, and then we'll talk about the pull request that I made. So for most of you watching and most of you attending, I'm sure you've heard of the Kubernetes Client Go project, which is basically a what I call a repeater repo. It's like an export of certain parts of the Kubernetes core, which might eventually turn into like a wholly separate project that doesn't take pieces of the core. I'm not exactly sure what the long-term plan is, but basically it's a project that lets you consume Kubernetes API objects and a Golang client that lets you talk to an API server, talk to the Kubernetes core API server and get these API objects out. So there are 2 flavors of these clients, and the 2 flavors are, there's what is identified in package name as being the internal client set, and then there's something that's identified as being the client set. The difference between these two is that the client set works with the versioned APIs, and the internal client set works with the internal APIs. So if for those of you that may not know this, the scheme that we have for APIs in Kubernetes is basically a star schema, where the inside of the star is this internal API that basically is a superset of all the versioned API fields, or maybe not proper superset, but has some conversion logic associated with it to make all the different version APIs for a particular group mutually intelligible and translatable. So what I mean by this is that we are currently building a versioned API, which is called V1 Alpha 1 of the Service Catalog API. And as we prove things about this API out, we'll undoubtedly find things that will say, hey, we really should have named this field Zorp instead of Blarb, all right? Or Throbber instead of Frobulator. So just as an example, we'll probably reach a point where we cut a V1 Beta 1 version of this API. And in fact, we did this 3 times before Kubernetes V1. We had V1 Beta 1, V1 Beta 2, V1 Beta 3. And the purpose of having the internal API is to be able to translate between them. So if I create a V1 Alpha 1 binding, as an example, and we later introduce V1 Beta 1, I should be able to get a V1 Beta 1 view of this V1 Alpha 1 object by converting it into the internal format and then converting internal format into V1 Beta 1. So with all of that context now expressed, these 2 different types of client sets, client set is the name of name of these particular flavors of clients. So these two different types of client sets deal with different APIs. The internal one is for the unversioned API, and the one that's just called client set is for the versioned API. Now, this gets us to what Morgan has done, and one thing that I missed while I reviewed the code for that is that Morgan's poll that added this client set to our repository identified it as being an internal client set, which would mean that it worked with the unversioned API, when in fact the client set that was generated actually deals with the versioned objects. So I realized this over the weekend as I was prototyping an Informer-based controller, and I spent a little time trying to get the internal unversioned client set to actually generate correctly, and I ran into some issues which I haven't had a chance to sort out yet. So for the time being, I made a pull request, which is 340, that basically renames what is currently in the repo as the internal client set to just the client set, and doesn't generate an internal one. Does that make sense? I realize I have been talking now at length for 10 minutes, and I'm not helping my case by continuing to talk. So I will stop talking now. Tell me if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. I want to see, I guess I need to see the example in Kubernetes land of the unversioned one versus the versioned one.
Okay.
So Paul, when do you see us needing to use the unversioned one? Is it from the controller?
Now that's a good question, Doug. So the practice that is recommended at this point, although I happen to personally disagree with this, is that controllers should use the versioned API, and things inside the API server that need access to the API, like emission controllers, should use the internal API. So the controller, if we were to follow the practices of Kubernetes, which I think is a good idea, should use the versioned API.
So then when does the unversioned one get used?
At this point, I don't think that we have an immediate use for it. So it's not a huge deal to not have it for now. In fact, I think I'd probably rather wait until we have a use case to generate it. I would like to have somebody work the bug that I either found or improve the documentation to tell me that I'm doing it wrong, because I wasn't able to get it to generate an internal one correctly. But I don't think we have a strong need for one at this moment.
Hey, Paul. I'm sorry if you already said it and I missed it, but wouldn't the communication between the controller and the API server use the unversioned /internal API?
So that's just what I've been talking about. That as an example, so like client Go actually only exports the versioned client.
Right.
And I will be totally honest with you all. I am still attempting to track down all of the reasoning behind that, because I do not personally agree with that.
Okay.
So that's the state of that. But in the, all of those things aside, we should make what we have there labeled correctly and have the right path. So that's what 340 does. Okay. Satisfied, Morgan?
Yep. I didn't realize you were waiting on me. Yes, that's fine. I just it sounds like, yeah, if we don't need it, I won't worry about it until we need it. And we got what we need so far. I don't mind looking at the client gen thing, or at least following up on it, but I don't really understand what it should look like still. So again, example, but
well, that's also probably an area where we can improve the documentation about that stuff. So Wes, the next thing on the agenda since I moved MVP1 burn down discussion is your item.
Sweet.
Is it pretty standard by any chance?
I already told you guys about this. It's definitely going to be pretty standard. I think I mentioned this down when I was in Boulder, but I did want to give a heads up that we did get a talk for GCP Next. That's our version of reInvent for folks that don't know what Google Cloud Platform Next is. And it's going to be, we're going to see if we can demo some of the early work in the service catalog.
When is GCP Next?
When is it?
Yeah.
It's March. I think the talk is on like March 9th, 10th, 8th, somewhere around there. 8th? Brandon's giving me hand signals. It's like second week in March.
Okay.
And so we know it's sort of pre-alpha. We know it's super early. I think we're going to see if we can keep a fairly stable demo branch alive that we can work with. And the plan was to try and use some of the Google Cloud Platform Service Broker work that another team did for Cloud Foundry, and try to demo some of that and how, hey, you can consume this from a Kubernetes cluster now instead of just Cloud Foundry. So I wanted to give a heads up that we did get that in. I'm not going to be giving the talk. Martin Ganholm's going to be giving the talk. And the other thing that we're trying to see if we can get into the talk is partnering with another team here at Google called Istio. And I don't know how many folks are familiar with it. I think I told Gabe about this when I was in Boulder, but I wanted to make sure that everyone else knew what was going on here.
Istio just entered, was just donated to CNCF. Is that accurate?
That is, yeah, that's, I believe that's correct. I haven't talked to them, but I think I saw that.
It was donated already? I thought that was sort of still in talks.
It might still be in talks. I'm not the PM for it. I'd have to double check. I know that they were talking about donating it.
Yeah, because I don't think they wanted to do it quite yet. I think they wanted to have something up and running first, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But anyway, we've been working with them on sort of proof of concept stuff to deploy Istio as part of a binding call and add some network functions to it, just as a, hey, if this would be cool to add some things around like quota management and load balancing, some of the Istio-esque features. So anyway, I just wanted to give everyone the heads up on that. If you have questions or if there's things you want us to see, I know, Paul, you have a talk later on in the month, so we don't want to steal a lot of your thunder.
Yeah, let me keep all my bolts of thunder in my quiver. Okay.
Yeah. So we're gonna try to split it between Istio and the service catalog stuff, and not go too deep on any one of those aspects, just to leave enough meat for your talk.
Just out of curiosity, Wes, did you invite any of the IBMers working on Istio to the talk?
I don't know because I am not on the Istio team. They did mention this morning that a lot of the IBM guys were well aware of the GCP Next talk and sort of the service catalog integration. I can follow up on that though. I know they're working pretty closely.
Yeah, because I'm sure if given the opportunity, they would love to join forces with you guys and make it look like it's not just a Google thing; it's an IBM thing as well.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk with Louis Ryan's the guy from our side, the tech lead for that, and I'll just shoot him a heads up.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I got something cool to share that's not on the agenda today. I'll just share that I was in a meeting where Service Broker developed at Red Hat that applies Ansible playbooks was demoed today, and it's certainly like work in progress alpha type version, but the thing works. So that's pretty cool. So we've got about 17 minutes left. I really sincerely doubt that we can get through a burn down type arrangement of tasks in the next 17 minutes. So I'll put it to the group. How would you like to use this time?
Could we maybe talk about like the whole if the like pod injection stuff is going to be in that API server, or if it's going to be like separate, or I don't know, that's too much.
Yeah. Do you want to take the floor, Jess, and present
Sure.
that to the group? Go for it. You got it.
So there's two separate things kind of going on at the that are kind of at play here. So there's the proposal for the pod injection policy, and then on Kubernetes, the repo, there was a pull request made for an API server for this. Which now, of course, I can't find the number.
So just someone's proposing a dedicated API server just for the service injection policy stuff?
Yeah.
Huh.
So
there's a lot of separate API server stuff going on for this and for that. And
it's
hopefully we
never.
get the federation thing out.
Yeah, so I didn't know like if this is going to be implemented as that, or if it's going to be not, or what we're doing.
Yeah, I don't know. Jess, you and I need to probably spend some time talking with folks tomorrow to try to get that nailed down, since in order for it to make 1.6, we've got to get this stuff in by the end of February.
Yeah.
So,
I thought this stuff was going to be an admission controller, so wouldn't that be part of the core?
Yeah, so that's what I thought too. I received some feedback from one of the people at Red Hat that works on API machinery that they thought that this should wait until aggregation was available everywhere and we had initializers, but that is in pretty much direct conflict with my personal goals about when I would like to provide the business value. So I had some numerous personal distractions that kept me kind of 50% available last week of work. I just haven't had a chance to sort it out with them yet. I would like very much for this to be implemented in 1.6 personally.
Are you against the idea of doing it as a mission controller in 1.6?
I am 100% for the idea of doing it in the core and as an emission controller in 1.6.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, there we go. We have consensus.
That's
Well,
right.
we
We absolutely do have consensus.
Yeah.
Yes, in the group, we have consensus. Yeah, so I tell you what, Jess, as a takeaway, why don't you and I talk offline after this, and we'll see when our schedules overlap tomorrow. And
Okay,
we'll try to get this sorted out.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. Anything else? We have 13 minutes now. So, absent a strong desire to begin talking about burn down for MVP1, I tell you what, do folks have availability to meet on Wednesday, and we can have one of these breakout sessions where we talk about that stuff?
Sounds good to me.
Doug, you're doing the Legolas thing where you said we control our density.
Yeah. You get the reference to the movie? Come on.
I do. I certainly do. That is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Well, there you go.
All right. Yes. Okay. So Wednesday, I will set up time for us to talk. and we'll get some burn down Gantt chart project management goodness going on.
Cool. Hey, Paul, quick question. This is Vile. You mentioned that you had wired the service catalog into Red Hat broker that was spinning up Ansible-based thinkers.
I just to disambiguate, I saw only the service broker being used with curl.
Okay, great. I was curious if there was any examples of how to wire parameters into the service instances of bindings. Read the thing that we talked about on Slack yesterday.
Yeah, they actually haven't gotten to parameters yet.
Okay. Okay, great. Because I was basically playing with the GCP. There is a service broker that has been open source, then it's available out there, and I was basically spinning up things like storage and whatnot, and there's both auth and parameters, and I was able to hack around auth quite easily, and then the parameters was a bit trickier, so I was curious if I was the only one or the first one running in this issue.
Yeah, I think you might be the first one, Vile, and I think that we need some design about how we're going to handle this because, yeah, I think it's tricky to find the right API. I assume, though, that you were able to get it to work, it sounds like.
Well, with some hand waving, sure, yeah.
Okay, I can probably guess about the shape of the hand waving. I would guess you had to put serialized JSON.
Yeah, there was
things, right?
That almost seemed to work, but there was I tried a few different things, but it was basically just it seemed like a lot of work for somebody who wants to go ahead and just come in and saying, "Hey, I want to pass this string to the broker."
I 100% agree with you, so okay, folks, what Vile and I are talking about is that when we were going through and making the API round trippable, we had formerly left in a placeholder that was like map of string to interface, and this interface does not is not really supported by all the API machinery in Kubernetes. So what we did is the version API has a raw extension type, and internal API has a runtime.object type. Basically, this is how we represent like opaque fields that are serialized JSON. It's not a user-friendly way to represent this in the API, and so we need to figure out. And Jessica Forrester, you probably have some ideas about this. What a good way of representing parameters that can take on like arbitrary types in the API is. So as another takeaway, Vile, tell you what, let's look right now. And I want to say that I have made an issue for this, but let's just check. Okay, so I made an issue number 270, that I'll link into the chat. And Vile, since you're working on stuff that uses this, are you interested in trying to work on the design for how we eventually handle this?
I can. The only caveat is I'm going to be gone next week.
Okay.
Depending on how much this week, I'm more than happy to tackle it.
Okay. Awesome. So that's the issue, and maybe you and I can talk about this. I have some ideas that I'll spell out more fully in the issue.
Sounds like a plan, man.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'll follow that, Paul, from the client perspective.
Cool. Sweet. Synergy.
Go team.
Okay. Anything else, folks? I'm not hearing anything. All right. Well, I bid you all good day. Thanks for joining. Thanks for watching, those of you on YouTube. And we will see you all on the internet. Later.